René Bull was born in Dublin in 1872 to a French mother and an English father. And despite his obvious youthful affinity for drawing and painting, in his later teens he left for Paris to study engineering. But as luck would have it, while there he met and took drawing lessons from the highly successful and influential French cartoonist Emmanuel Poiret, much better known by his alias Caran d'Ache. Bull subsequently abandoned all thought of a career in engineering and on his return to Ireland began to contribute illustrations and cartoons to various Irish magazines and newspapers. He soon realised that if he was going to enjoy any significant success, he needed to relocate to London, where there were many more opportunities for work, and in 1892 he did just that. It didn't take long before he was working regularly as a cartoonist for any number of popular magazines, and it was with this kind of comedic work that he had the most significant early success. But despite his own tendencies towards humour, just a few years later in 1896, he was hired to work as a war correspondent for the magazine Black and White. And in that capacity he travelled extensively around the world with his sketchbook and camera equipment to various locations where wars were taking place. There were plenty to choose from, and he eventually ended up in South Africa to make drawings and photographic records of the Boer War for publication back home. This necessitated getting rather close to the actual battle scenes, and it can't have been too much of a surprise when Bull was actually wounded and had to be sent back to London to convalesce. In the meantime, the drawings he had made were published as a book and sold quite well, as did seats for his many lecture tours about his experiences. Understandably, once fully recovered from his injuries, he abandoned that career in favour of safer and lighter subject matter, and his magazine output was now resolutely humorous. His earlier studies with Caran d'Ache had quite obviously had a strong and enduring impact on his own comedic output, but there was never any hint of mere copying, more an absorption of sound principles, especially when it came to sequential work. And in addition to the large volume of cartoons he created for British magazines, he also made an appearance, apparently solitary, in the French humour magazine Le Rire, with this satirical image about contemporary London. In 1904, Bull also began to have his sequential humour published in the illustrious Punch, although not with the same frequency as with his other magazine clients. But all his humorous images were created with great definition in his line work, which, unusually for the time in magazine illustration, was generally devoid of the heavy hatching favoured by most of his contemporaries, and had a similar graphic quality not often seen outside the British children's comics of the period. And he used the same linear simplicity in the production of a highly successful series of comic postcards, which began in the middle of the decade. Unlike virtually all his magazine illustrations, these were printed in colour, but it has to be said, like much graphic ephemera of the time, not very well. It was applied with little subtlety to Bull's expressive line work, as it was in early comics, with dot screens clearly visible to the naked eye. But whatever their printed shortcomings, it did not deter the public from buying and sending them in large numbers. And for Bull it was an easy way to increase his earnings and public profile, and he created quite a few in subsequent years. It was in 1907 that Bull made his first significant appearance in an illustrated book, with his contributions to an edition of Uncle Remus's Stories of Brer Rabbit, written originally by Joel Chandler Harris in 1881. This was a joint commission with fellow humorist Harry Rowntree, and it has to be said it was Rowntree who had the lion's share of the images with his full-page colour work. Bull was somewhat relegated to second fiddle and charged with producing small monochrome pen and ink spot illustrations, which were dotted about within the text at key moments of the narrative. Nevertheless, despite their lesser contribution, they were a collection of particularly endearing and well-drawn anthropomorphic images, which fulfilled their function with considerable success. Again, hatching and other evocations of tonal grey were largely absent, and much was left to the reader's imagination in all these little scenarios. And when the book was subsequently reprinted, as it was numerous times, Bull's illustrations also had washes of colour added to give them additional appeal for the younger readers. Whether it was Bull himself who coloured them isn't recorded, and it was certainly not always the case when images were coloured at a later date, but whoever added the colour did it with dexterity, and succeeded in making them look as if they had been intentionally created that way in the first place. But otherwise it was illustration for his magazine client base which continued to dominate his output. Punch was still an occasional platform for the sequential Caran d'Ache derived dialogue-free sequences he'd become so adept at creating, and at this time his work featured regularly in the Bystander magazine, printed with a not overly successful use of tonal grayscale. It wasn't until 1912 that Bull eventually returned to book illustration, but he did so in style with a spectacular illustrated gift book edition of the Arabian Nights. As was common practice, and as he had done in the earlier Brer Rabbit book, he created line-only monochromes throughout, especially for chapter headings and small spot illustrations. And in their own right they formed a particularly pleasing series of narrative images. But more significantly, this expensively bound publication also featured a large collection of breathtaking full-colour page illustrations, which for the first time showed what Bull was capable of when given free rein with ink and watercolour. Where the colour-washed Brer Rabbit images has been quite casually, even if appealingly rendered, it was the skill and evocative purpose of his application of colour which really enhanced the well-drawn line work which served as their foundation. This commission also gave him the perfect opportunity to showcase his considerable facility for meaningful characterization, body language and facial expressions, in both the more comical and more conventionally representational figures populating the stories. And these images also clearly showed that he was every bit as capable of successfully combining both the more outlandishly comic and the serious anatomical templates in the same image as his better-known Golden Age contemporaries. And whether their intent was comic, dramatic or romantic, and even on occasion a blend of all three, every one of the illustrations Bull produced made for a highly engrossing, memorable and enduring visualization of this much illustrated collection of fantasies, which was in all ways the equal of better-known editions created both before and since. 1913 also saw the publication of Alfred Edwin Johnson's book The Russian Ballet, which, as the title indicates, was a tribute in words and pictures to the work of this most prestigious dance ensemble. It was somewhat of an unusual choice of subject matter, and given the relatively few in British society at the time who would have had the remotest interest in ballet, Russian or otherwise, its appeal must surely have been limited. It's possible that with that in mind it was published as an expensive limited edition for the more cultured and better off, but I have no proof of that. The book contained plenty of expertly evoked monochrome figure studies, along with full-page line and watercolour pages of captured moments from various notable ballets performed by the troupe, which, however esoteric in subject matter, was still engrossing romantic illustrations. Bull was at his most prolific in this period, and it was also in 1913 that the considerable popular success of the Arabian Nights led to the publication of a similarly bound and decorated edition of the rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Given the Arabic origins of these verses, it was of course also filled with similar Middle Eastern locations and characters. But where the Arabian Nights had been intended for younger readers, the rubaiyat was a considerably less fanciful, although still exotic classical collection which could generally be considered to be romantic in nature and therefore of more interest to adults. The full pages all appeared with this decorative graphic border which I felt I should show, but I've removed it from other examples in order to display the actual illustration bigger on screen. Whether his earlier travel to the region in his capacity as war correspondent had helped with his visual research, I have no idea, but as with the previous Arabian Nights, his evocation of place and time was once more immaculate in its execution. And it's worth noting that the characters depicted were considerably more plausibly Arabic in origin than those found in other versions. As with all Bull's work, the monochromes were no less appealing and descriptive, and were also conspicuous in the success of what was included and what was left to the imagination in these small but telling vignettes. 1914 of course saw the declaration of war on Germany, and although already 42 years old, Bull joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve as a lieutenant and was eventually transferred to the Royal Air Force, where he reached the rank of major. Nevertheless, he seems to have somehow managed to continue working as an illustrator, and in 1915 a translation of Prosper Mérimée 1845 novel Carmen, which had also inspired the later opera by Bizet, was published with many illustrations by Bull. Again, this was a far from mainstream publication, but the work Bull produced added considerably to broadening its appeal. It followed the expected pattern of pen and ink monochromes of the characters vignetted on the page, and a large number of elaborate and suitably passionate colour pages illustrating key moments from this tempestuous and ultimately tragic Spanish love story. Although there was no explicitly sexual or violent content, there was an intensity to this novel, and consequently Bull's evocative images were certainly not aimed at younger readers. And this was a particularly fine example of the kind of richly illustrated books being created for adult readers published in this period. Hubert Strang's novel The Old Man of the Mountain was published in 1916, but colour was entirely absent this time around, and it featured quite a few line illustrations by Bull, many of which were used as small spot images within the text. But there were also some full-page images which better demonstrated his compositional prowess and plausible solidity of his pen technique. Following the end of the war in 1918, evidence of any work of any kind by Bull becomes rather thin on the ground, and all I could find were a couple of cartoons for the magazine The Passing Show, the latest example of which was dated 1925. As I mentioned in the introduction, there were many books he illustrated or contributed to between the wars, but frustratingly most revealed no usable images whatsoever. However, I did manage to find quite a few pen and ink illustrations from his 1928 edition of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. As with so much of his output, the large volume of narrative images he created for this book gave further proof, if it was needed, that for Bull the use of colour was always a happy and visually agreeable bonus, but unlike some of his contemporaries, the quality of his expressive line drawing certainly didn't rely on it. Each page was intelligently composed, and the exotic worlds encountered by Gulliver and his interaction with their inhabitants expertly visualised. In the same year he was among several others who contributed to Rose Fileman's collection of poems, A Garland of Roses, for which I could only find this solitary but delightful example. It was in the early 1930s that Bull was first commissioned by the Churchman Tobacco Company to provide colour illustrations for various themed series of humorous cigarette cards. At this time, a large proportion of the population smoked cigarettes, and to encourage sales of a particular brand, tobacco companies would place cards with an illustration on the front and text on the back into their cigarette packs as an incentive to keep buying the product, simply in order to be the proud owner of a full series, unless emphysema or cancer took you first, of course. Absurd as this now sounds, it was a popular pastime in Britain for several decades in the middle of the century. Because they were printed so small, the dot screen printing is all too visible at the magnified scale shown here. But whatever their reprographic shortcomings, Bull's images were invariably engagingly comedic and drawn with considerable suggestion of animation. They continued to be published and collected into the later years of the 1930s, but when war broke out again in 1939, despite being 67 years old, Bull worked at the Air Ministry as a technical advisor. And 3 years later, in 1942, he died in London at the age of 70. In his lifetime, René Bull was undoubtedly among the most popular British illustrators of the early 20th century. But for reasons I can't understand, he is also among those who have become particularly neglected by subsequent generations, while a select few, such as Rackham, Dulac and Heath Robinson, have become dominant. I have no problem at all with the praise and attention awarded to the better remembered illustrators, and I'm among those who frequently sing their praises. But I don't see how admiration seems to be such a finite resource. The evidence of Bull's work, and more tellingly the absence of much of it, and others I have already covered or will be covering in later instalments, clearly shows that there is a pronounced imbalance in terms of who gets to be remembered and who doesn't. And my hope, as always, is that this small tribute goes at least some way to rectifying that.